and the floor is now all to Rahul Mehrotra, please.
So thank you very much for this invitation to the Embassy in Switzerland. It's always a pleasure to be here, wonderful setting. Thanks for being here. Alfredo, thanks very much for an overarching introduction. I think these are the bang-on issues that we all deal with. In continuing with the conversations that we've had in Chandigarh, which is, I think, what this evening is about, I'm going to start with Chandigarh, but we are discussing Chandigarh and smart cities, so we're going to try to connect it in some way. Of course, Chandigarh, as we all know, was an incredible experiment. It was a symbol of modernity. It was about individual freedom within the welfare state that you were describing, a kind of socialist state with amazing sort of aspirations. But Chandigarh, we judged quite soon in terms of its urbanism. We were very critical of Chandigarh as a city. Oh, I'm sorry, I should go back. I should put the sound on. Apologies.
In 1956, in front of a considerable crowd, President Nehru inaugurated the new capital of Punjab. The French architect Le Corbusier, who had constructed the capital and outlined the plans of the city, attended personally the ceremony. 500,000 persons will be accommodated in Chandigarh.
Chandigarh today, horizontal, spreading as far as the eye can see, its plan no longer discernible. Where there is order, there is harmony, Le Corbusier said. He always maintained that right angles were better than wavering lines, so he planned the city like a checkerboard. There are 7 main thoroughfares. Roads 1, 2, and 3 take the heavy traffic. Road 4 is for shopping. Roads 5 and 6 are feeders from and to city sections. Road 7 is a parkway. Such is the ambitious plan of this city, which is still free of major traffic problems.
So in any case, you see mobility was a problem, clearly. The city was sparse. We were critical of its urbanism. I believe we judged the city too quickly. It was considered a failure of urbanism, public transportation, etc. It was a wonderful diagram. And you see green infrastructure, you see a simple grid, very robust. But it took a generation for the city to be populated. Even India's survival kit said, Chandigarh is a great disappointment, dismal and dull, like so many examples of mid-century urban planning, ugly. And they said, Lake Chand's garden is something of an amusement. But we all agreed that the buildings were stunning. And I mean, the profession here went sort of flocking there to see these buildings. And that was sort of celebrated positively. But clearly, at India's independence, though apparently closing the debate on architecture and identity, did not produce a society for which the country had hoped and yearned. Instead, all efforts were directed towards dealing with the splintered society that the nation had inherited. A society fractured by caste, class, economic disparities, rural-urban divides, and a multitude of beliefs and religious affiliations that were welded together as a nation-state. And we've seen this surfacing over the last few decades with the Mandal Commission and all of that. And the other thing was that really the aesthetic modernity came to us here before social modernity. And there was already a disjuncture that was inherent there. And I think it was necessary politically for many reasons. But it's a problem that as architects, of course, we had to deal with. And the next generation of Indian architects, the first generation of Indian architects, did a remarkable job in actually addressing those questions inspired by Chandigarh and many other great pieces of architecture. But India eventually landed up with cities like this. I mean, cities that Alfredo generalized more globally, but it's about inequity, it's about the disparities, it's about these crazy disjunctures, and it's about people, essentially. In Mumbai, 7 million people live in slums. It's a city which is about incrementalism. This is called the 5 stages of squatting. This is really how our cities are built. Somebody comes over the summer, they put a shed in the monsoon, they build around them. This guy's in the 3rd stage of squatting. But by the end of the year, it's part of the paraphernalia of the city. So there's this sort of incrementalism. It's a self-help city. But just to summarize that, for me, in the Indian condition, which is an extreme, I think, in the global south or below the political equator, elasticity, incrementalism, appropriation, deappropriation, reappropriation of space, the question of soft thresholds where you have transgressions between different parts of society actually become the questions that we have to deal with and are challenged as architects to find design solutions for. In fact, architecture is not even, in my belief, the spectacle of the Indian cities. There are many other simultaneous spectacles like these great festivals, etc., that co-opt the imagery of the static city to construct new hybrid kinds of spectacles, which is absolutely amazing. And that's what comprises the popular visual culture, which we don't quite know how to integrate as planners. In fact, this is the landscape of impatient capital. This is what we allude to when we think of smartness, when we think of, I mean, people talk about Dubai and the efficiency of Shanghai, but it's brittle form. And of course, this is no place. This is a Photoshop construction by HSBC. But the reality is this: we have a city where these adjacencies between extreme forms of poverty and wealth all coalesce together, and that's the construction that should challenge us, because I think we've got to find the right urban form for that kind of condition, which is not to say there shouldn't be social mobility, but how can architecture be used, urban design be used as an instrument to facilitate this mobility? And our wise man Lalu Prasad said this: we can't sell shoes in showrooms and food on the footpath, which is exactly what's happening. We have large malls with air conditioning where fancy shoes are sold, but we buy all our food off carts on the sidewalk with incredible pollution. So I think in our post-liberalized situation, what is the truth is that architecture is not used to construct the identity of the state. It is, in fact, it is now we engage with a statistical architecture at the level of the state and image building, which is about GDP, and we freak out every time the GDP of China goes up or down by 1%, and what do we do? And so we construct our identity through this sort of statistical architecture, and as an extension of that through infrastructure, highways, many other forms of infrastructure which connect places but don't actually place make. Furthermore, we isolate, so we create these enclaves, whether they're in the form of high-rise buildings or secession from the city in the form of gated communities on the periphery of the city. And that really is the condition that is sort of emerging now in terms of the form of the city. So in this context, I mean, I think an extension of that is, and I show this because Gift City, I believe, was the genesis of the smart city idea. Of course, the smart city idea was being talked about globally with IBM and Cisco at the height of the American recession to sell their wares, really. And it was caught up, I mean, it was picked up by our politicians. But Gift City, which happened, this is part of the Gujarat model, which happened in Narendra Modi's home state, was actually a forerunner to the imagination of smart cities. And so it's interesting that the chief CEO says Gift City will be like foreign territory. That's a really loaded word because there's already imagery that is embedded in that description, which is this brittle form, a CCTV ripoff, which is thrown in all in Photoshop. And this is what they're building in Gift City. I mean, they're not getting off the ground for various reasons. But it's interesting that this could even be so explicitly outlined. And I just want to share this with you. I got this off the internet. It's not in the public domain.
The financial service sector is fast emerging as the growth engine with world-class technology, seamless connectivity, state-of-the-art infrastructure, and the finest talent pool. Analysts forecast the sector is poised to contribute up to 10 to 11 million jobs by 2020 in India. It is against this conducive backdrop that GIFT, the Gujarat International Finance Tech City, a Government of Gujarat project, is being implemented by GIFT CL, a joint venture of GUDC and INFS. Gujarat, a preferred investment destination due to its political stability, strong leadership, pro-business policies, and vast talent pool. What's more, its intrinsic entrepreneurial spirit, backed by reliable resources and strong infrastructure, only adds to the advantage factor. The geostrategic positioning of GIFT will enable operators to service geographically extreme financial markets by bridging far-flung time zones. Accentuating the advantage factors, GIFT is located between Gandhinagar and Ahmedabad and also connected to the fastest growing Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor planned along the NH8. GIFT also provides easy access to the Ahmedabad International Airport via a dedicated road link. Additionally, Metro and BRTS assures access to and fro from all sides. The bird's eye view reveals the futuristic design that GIFT is. A truly international and high-tech city spread over 886 acres of land by the riverside, the master plan is divided into two zones. A notified multiple services special economic zone with processing and non-processing areas, and the remaining area as domestic tariff area, the DTA. Urban form of the city is guided by superior infrastructure, futuristic buildings, immaculate green spaces.
I mean, this can go on, and I don't want to dwell on this. It's a long video. But essentially, I think Jagdish Bhagwati, the economist, said that in India, to use the SEZ was like building scaffolding on a building after the building was built. It was a very particular model that came out of China, so that's highly problematic. But really, I wanted to stop at the question of urban form, because the rest of the video on urban form will make all the architects really sweat here. It's just terrible. But so the question is, what is this imagination of a smart city? Because the key features in a smart city sort of intersect between competitiveness, capital, and some broad definition of sustainability. And the smart city should be able to, in this view, provide good infrastructure, water, sanitation, reliable utilities, healthcare, attract investment, transparent processes and e-governance, and make the citizens feel safe and happy. But in a sense, that's good urban planning, no? I mean, I think, well, so by networking it through technology is what makes it smart. I think we need to really interrogate that. And what does even sustainability, transparent, all that mean? But we can talk about that in the discussion. Now, the irony of this is that although, of course, we're making great strides in data and mapping and all of that, planning in India sits on a very, very, very thin, precarious thin layer of data. And that's why you have NGOs who supplement this with the work they do on the ground, fill the data gaps, etc. And for the kind of IBM, Cisco model, you can't found it without data, but also the notion of messiness because of the incrementality, etc., by which our cities grow in this kind of economy, which won't change overnight, becomes in question. In fact, one of my colleagues, Eve Blau, describes this very beautifully. She says East Europe, a lot of Latin America, India, is transitioning out of socialism into some form of capitalism, neoliberalism, some hybrid form. But she said these transitions are simultaneous, which means for 20 years we will be in the process of transitioning out of something and simultaneously be transitioning into something. Now, this is a very messy condition, especially for architects, patronage, the role of civil society, etc. And so what does design mean, and what are the strategies, whether they're temporal or permanent, that one has to engage in this? This is very important, and the smart city seems to be, at least the way it is articulated, as a quick fix in a sense. So I think the problems, if I may just list a few very quickly, is universalization, which is it doesn't consider geographies, coastal cities, hills, at least in its broad imagination. I think in the process the government is engaging with ways that this data comes from particular cities. It tends towards the idea of Rem Koolhaas of the generic city, which is stripped of identity. It's usually a list of hardware, IT, transportation, and all of that. I don't think they've ever discussed smart cities and municipalities and smart cities going bankrupt. Global cities is the imagination that they sort of work with, which is really about making the arrival of capital frictionless. And that's why it becomes a landscape of impatient capital. It's not human-centric at all, because the human being is not part of this discussion. There's a token missed there, affordable housing. So I think, is this idea of a smart city which is built in generic space and unfolds in generic time useful? Is the smart city about overspecification? Is the smart city based on the discredited notion of seamlessness, frictionless conditions? Are smart cities deployed, at least in the imagination, of the administrators as something that benefits their administrative ideas? And does the idea of the smart city assume as a given the neoliberal political economy? Because if that falls apart, the whole idea falls apart very quickly because it's founded so much on. And so I think, like I say, I think in China now there are hundreds of great cities or cities, let's say, but there are no Chinese cities. And so are we going to also engage with the generic? I mean, I think India with its tradition, I think we can do something completely different in terms of a direction. So the question really is, and I'm going to go through these two sections very quickly, is what is urban? Because, if you think of a city within an urban condition that's quite different, it naturally has to become a gated community. So what is urban? And this is just some research in progress, which I'll just share. We found population density, and you just look at the density of population and see where the cities are. And, they become one. It's a continuum. It's not even a series of cities. Whatever fine grain, you look at it by whatever census, by whatever definition, over 5,000, 75% of male in non-agricultural work, you cut it anyway, the densities are in very, very limited sort of areas. And you can see how the way they cluster, even if you add, there are about 7,500 towns if you take 5,000 as a cutoff limit. So it's amazing the extent of what is happening here. And as you see, it's all distributed, and any grain that you take it as criteria, and there are different criteria. So you take the criteria of a minimum of 5,000 population, you get a map like this. If you take the criteria as a density of 400 people per square kilometers, you get a density like this. If you look at irrigation, it maps, of course, totally with the density. And then there are many other sort of issues that you can discern from that. If you look at the network of smart cities, which is what the government has selected, the 100 smart cities, of course on highway routes, etc., it's not mapped on the density. So you'll find a lot of cities. Now, what is the intent of those to trigger off growth, or is this again in generic space? Because of political economy in the way that's spread out through the country. And then if you start zooming into the Bombay-Mumbai corridor, you realize, of course, naturally that's going to by default grow, and it's an intelligent thing the government is focusing there. That is the settlements of towns and of small and big towns, because even those small pink dots have over 5,000 people. So can you imagine that density? So this brings up the question of what is the form of the city, because here we are talking about not a city as a contained smart city as it imagined, but it's a continuum almost, as you can say. And of course, the corridors of growth will accelerate that even more. A simplified version of this is about 7 or 8 megacities, 28 tier 2 cities, metropolises, with 1 to 4 million people, and then they are 393, I think with the new census this has gone up into the 400s, which are 100,000 to 1 million people, which will all become 1 million people probably in the next 20 or 30 years. So 400 million Indians are going to live there. And I can really bet that if we collectively tried to come up with those 400 names, we couldn't do it. It's below our radar. All the architects, planners, the new young generation that comes out, it's focused on the 7 and maybe 14 or 15 of the other cities. And in the process of doing this data and research, and my hunch is 75% of the profession is based outside those 393 cities where there is no capacity and where change can actually happen because it's less contested. So we looked at the Kumbh Mela because we found, wow, that's a fantastic city that seems to work. And we did this project from the university to map the Kumbh Mela. I think you all know what the Kumbh Mela looks like, so I don't, okay. Yeah, I won't go into the video. But we looked at this and it was very interesting. It was an interdisciplinary project which involved many schools. We looked at many different aspects of it. We found that somewhere At the turn of the 1900s, the British tried to rationalize it because some officer must have freaked out when he saw 7 million people there. So they used the English town planning thing and they just put out a rational grid. Then, of course, Chandigarh came along and they looked at Chandigarh and then they started having a sector system and then they took the grid to another level, and it's an incredibly robust grid where every street goes across the river using a pontoon bridge. So you can't have a grid that's more robust than that. So it just sits on this ever-shifting landscape because the river settles in different ways every 12 years. So it was interesting that suddenly studying this and looking back at Chandigarh, many things began, at least in my mind, that appears all in a period of 6 weeks. They set up a city with infrastructure for 7 million people to live there and another 100 to visit it. But it is linked incredibly powerfully to the geography it sits around. The Kumbh is the red dot, to the towns, the villages, the road, the rail network. There's a very complicated material geography in the way materials come in, some temporarily, some more permanently, and then they get recycled back out into that geography through this network. So it's dynamic in that sense on a kind of temporal scale. And of course, when the river sort of floods, it washes every little detail out, but the grid is what is so robust because it sits on this sort of shifting landscape. And another interesting thing, this is sort of unrelated but very exciting for me, that the whole Kumbh Mela is made out of 5 materials. It's made out of 8-foot bamboo, screws and nuts, string and rope, corrugated metal, and forms of fabric, plastic, textiles. Those are the 5 materials that are used at all scales for all buildings. And that's why it deploys so quickly and so fast and can be dismantled so fast. They're humongous structures which get decorated, they become community centers, and then it gets dismantled in these different stages. The security is highly intelligent. It is 10,000 square feet for one security person. They become part of the community and use technology, iPhones, etc., to keep track of people. And you look at the statistics. I mean, it is just amazing that it works with a complexity and a spectrum that's such as this. And you look at this, what it looks like every quarter. It's a wonderful example of the grid becoming a formal structure with infrastructure and informality getting mapped on it. So which means within every quarter, people do what they do according to their beliefs. They create and construct their own identities. A district magistrate is the power that the person who runs it is given. It has a fascinating governance structure where the implementation flips down to a separate system during implementation. And I don't want to go into this, but it's fascinating at every level of what we might engage with what is a smart city in an interesting way. And this is what the grid looks like. That's how it's deployed, the roads, the lights, and the city gets populated. On the last day, they have this ceremony. And what's amazing is for the 2 months that the city disappears, the grid yet exists. So the farmers in the area use the level ground and the grid to create one crop. So they actually stretch it in an elastic way into an amazing thing. And of course, then the river comes and it's flooded over and there is no memory of the city. So when one look back at Chandigarh and the grid, the green infrastructure, which has, now I don't mean that Chandigarh should be the model that we use for the smart cities. My point is only this, that embedded in this, coming out of a welfare state of socialism, of the sense of individual freedom, of equity, some of which of course fail, there is amazing potential to now reinterpret this, especially in the form of the green infrastructures, productive landscapes, many, many other things that we are much more sensitized to now as a community of planners, architects, and a society. And of course, you see it grow. There are problems with the periphery, but the fine grain has allowed life. You could modify this. This is like a grid of the Kumbh Mela, that inside could be densified, reformed based on needs, etc., without compromising the illusion of the city, although it has been sort of aggregated in different ways and different spaces, and it has even accommodated aberrations like that, which are very interesting. But of course, the solutions for Chandigarh will lie in the way it can network with its hinterland. And the smart cities, which is now, this is from India Today, there's of course a huge gap. It's not adding much value in terms of funding. If you look at what is a smart city as put out by the government, it is basically good planning. It's land use, mobility, water supply, electricity, and then there is an added on thing that you would network this. So I think a strength of the smart city idea is that we're discussing cities for the first time. We have to use it as a Trojan horse to break the concentration of these silos and create these networks. But within that, I mean, the imagination is no different. These are the smart cities that have been listed. This is the process they're following for the qualifications. But this is the issue I want to raise. This is the smart cities from what you've seen in the resources, the research. This is the last slide. How should these investment allocations in infrastructure policies be realigned towards small towns to strengthen the urban-rural integration? That, I think, is what otherwise we'll have gated communities. And should planning paradigms for small towns differ from planning for large metropolitan areas? In the sense that if you're looking at, and that's the last point, if you're looking at the Indo-Gangetic Plain, you need a linear city, you need different typologies of cities. And I think where this debate is falling short and where we can learn from Chandigarh, and this is a conversation at least William Curtis and I started in Chandigarh, is what are the new taxonomies that we have to get involved with? How do we not universalize this? And how can we learn from our tradition, our past, and how can we learn from Chandigarh to go forward? Thank you very much.